Welcome to Ghostmire, where every night a new horror story drags you deeper than the last. Before anything else, hit subscribe right now. If you miss even one night, you'll miss the piece that connects all these stories into something far darker. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know exactly who's awake inside the dark with us. And listen carefully. This story has something hidden. A moment so disturbing, so unexpected that most people don't recognize it until the very end. If you leave early, you'll never know what really happened. So stay with me, all the way to the final second. Story 1. The rest stop that wasn't there. Marcus Chen had been hauling refrigerated goods across the Midwest for 12 years. He knew every rest stop, every truck plaza, and every safe place to pull over between Chicago and Denver. That's why what happened on Interstate 80 in western Nebraska still makes him question everything he thought he knew about that route. It was 2:47 a.m. on October 14, 2019. Marcus had been driving for 6 hours straight and his eyelids were getting heavy. The next official rest area wasn't for another 40 miles, but he spotted something unexpected. A rest stop sign indicating services 1 mile ahead. He didn't remember this stop existing, but fatigue was clouding his judgment. Maybe they'd built it recently. The exit ramp appeared exactly where the sign promised. As Marcus guided his Freightliner down the ramp, something felt off. The pavement was smooth, recently paved, but there were no reflectors, no lane markings. The rest stop itself was well lit, with a small brick building and about 6 parking spaces. 2 other semi-trucks were already parked there, their running lights on. Marcus pulled into a space and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and absolute. No highway noise, no wind, nothing. He stepped out of the cab and the air felt wrong, too still, too heavy, like the atmosphere before a severe storm. The temperature was at least 15 degrees colder than it had been on the highway. The brick building had a men's room sign and Marcus headed toward it. As he walked, he noticed the other 2 trucks. They were older models, one a 1970s-era Kenworth, the other an ancient Peterbilt with rust eating through the doors. Both had their engines running, but he couldn't hear them. No diesel rumble, no exhaust smell, just silence. Inside the restroom, everything was spotlessly clean but outdated. The fixtures looked like they were from the 1960s. Porcelain sinks with separate hot and cold taps. Metal stalls with gaps you could see through. The fluorescent lights hummed with an irregular pulse that made Marcus's head ache. He used the facilities quickly, eager to get back on the road. When he pushed open the door to leave, he froze. A man was standing directly outside, maybe 3 feet away. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, standard trucker attire, but his face was wrong. Not deformed or monstrous, just wrong. His features seemed slightly out of proportion, like a photograph that had been stretched vertically. His eyes were too far apart, his mouth too wide. "You shouldn't have stopped here," the man said. His voice sounded like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. Marcus stepped around him, walking quickly toward his truck. He looked back once. The man hadn't moved, but now there were 2 more figures standing beside him, both with that same wrong appearance. They were watching Marcus with expressions that might have been concern or might have been something else entirely. Marcus climbed into his cab, hands shaking as he turned the key. The engine roared to life, and he'd never been so grateful to hear that familiar diesel sound. He threw the truck into gear and headed for the exit ramp. In his side mirror, he could see the 3 figures still standing there, motionless, watching him leave. Back on Interstate 80, Marcus immediately felt the difference. Highway noise, wind buffeting the trailer, normal temperature. He checked his GPS. It showed he was exactly where he should be, but there was no rest stop marked anywhere in his location history. The GPS had no record of him exiting the highway. He grabbed his CB radio. "Anyone out there near mile marker 210 on I-80 westbound?" Static. Then a response. "Negative, driver. Nothing out there but empty prairie for the next 40 miles. Marcus insisted he'd just left a rest stop. Other drivers chimed in, some with 15 or 20 years on this route. None of them had ever seen a rest stop where Marcus described. One older driver finally spoke up, his voice crackling with interference. "Son, back in '73, there was a rest area right about where you're talking about. They closed it in '74 after 3 truckers went missing from there over a 2-month period. They never found any of them." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Small brick building, 6, maybe 8 parking spots. The CB went silent. Marcus drove the remaining distance to Denver without stopping, not even for fuel. He had 3/4 of a tank, enough to make it. When he got home, he researched the rest stop. He found newspaper archives from 1973 and 1974. 3 truckers had indeed vanished from a rest area in that exact location. Their trucks were found running, keys in the ignition, loads intact. The men were simply gone. Marcus still drives I-80, but he never stops in that area no matter how tired he gets. And sometimes, usually around 2:47 a.m., he sees it in his headlights. An exit ramp that shouldn't exist, leading to a rest stop that was demolished 46 years ago. He keeps driving, always keeps driving, and he never looks back. Story 2. The woman in the parking lot. Rebecca Torres had been a long-haul trucker for 8 years, and she'd never scared easily. She'd dealt with aggressive drivers, mechanical failures in the middle of nowhere, and every kind of weather nature could throw at her. But what happened at the rest stop outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico, changed something fundamental in how she saw the world. It was June 23rd, 2021, around 11:30 p.m. Rebecca pulled into the Klein's Corners rest area on Interstate 40, a place she'd stopped dozens of times before. It was a typical summer night in New Mexico, warm, clear, with stars so bright they looked artificial. The rest area was moderately busy with maybe 10 or 12 trucks scattered across the parking lot. Rebecca found a spot near the back, away from the idling trucks whose drivers were sleeping with their engines running for air conditioning. She preferred quiet when she rested. She did her routine post-parking checks, trailer secure, airlines connected, 5th wheel locked, and was about to climb back into her cab when she noticed the woman. She was standing in the empty space next to Rebecca's truck, just standing there in the darkness between overhead lights. She wore a simple dress, pale blue or gray, hard to tell in the sodium vapor lighting. Her hair was long and dark, hanging loose around her shoulders. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there perfectly still, facing Rebecca's truck. Rebecca called out. The woman didn't respond, didn't move. Rebecca felt uneasy but approached anyway. As she got closer, she could see the woman more clearly. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with pale skin and dark eyes. Pretty in a delicate way, but something was deeply wrong. The woman wasn't breathing. Rebecca watched her chest for 30 seconds, a full minute. No movement at all. Rebecca reached out but stopped herself from touching the woman. Some instinct screamed at her not to make physical contact. The woman's head turned, not her body, just her head rotating smoothly to face Rebecca. Her neck twisted at an angle that should have been impossible. Her eyes locked onto Rebecca's, and when she smiled, her mouth opened far too wide, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. The woman asked. Her voice was wrong, layered, as if 3 people were speaking in unison. "I need to get somewhere." Rebecca stumbled backward, her heart hammering. "No, I'm not taking passengers." The woman took a step forward, and Rebecca realized her feet weren't quite touching the ground. She hovered an inch above the asphalt, her dress moving in a breeze that didn't exist. "I just need a ride. I won't take up much space." Every instinct Rebecca had was screaming at her to run. She backed toward her cab, never taking her eyes off the woman. "I can't. Company policy." The woman's smile faded. Her expression became something else. Angry, hungry, desperate all at once. "I asked nicely," she said, and her voice had changed, become deeper, resonant with rage. Rebecca reached her cab and yanked the door open. She pulled herself up and slammed the door, hitting the lock button. Through the window, she could see the woman still standing there, watching. The woman raised one hand and pressed it against the driver's side window. The glass immediately fogged around her palm, frost spreading outward despite the 85-degree temperature. Rebecca started the engine, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the key. She had to get out of there. She put the truck in gear and started to pull forward. In her mirror, she watched the woman. She wasn't moving, just standing there. But her image was becoming translucent, fading like morning fog. Then Rebecca saw something that made her stomach drop. 3 trucks away, another woman was standing between vehicles. Different features, different dress, but the same impossible stillness, the same hovering stance. Rebecca looked around the parking lot and saw them. 5, 6, maybe 7 women scattered throughout the rest area, all standing in the shadows, all perfectly still, all watching the trucks around them. She pulled out of the parking space and headed for the exit, accelerating harder than she should have with a full load. As she passed one of the women, the figure turned to watch her go, and Rebecca saw her face clearly in the headlights. She was beautiful and terrible, her features too perfect, her eyes reflecting the light like an animal's. Rebecca didn't stop again until she reached Flagstaff, 200 miles west. She pulled into a well-lit truck stop surrounded by other drivers and activity. She reported what she saw to the facility manager, who looked at her with concern and suggested she might be experiencing hallucinations from fatigue. But Rebecca knew what she'd seen. She started researching and found reports going back decades. Truckers who'd disappeared from rest areas along I-40 in New Mexico. Their trucks found empty, engines running, no signs of struggle. 26 documented cases since 1967. Most dismissed as drivers walking away from their lives or falling victim to ordinary crime. Rebecca still drives I-40, but she never stops at Klein's Corners anymore. She'll drive an extra hour to avoid it. And sometimes when she passes that rest area late at night, she can see them in the parking lot, pale figures standing motionless between the trucks, waiting patiently for someone to say yes, waiting for someone to give them permission to climb aboard. She wonders how many drivers have said yes over the years. She wonders where those women take them. And she's grateful every single day that she trusted her instincts and said no. Story 3. The Bathroom Mirror. James Crawford was a regional driver working routes across the Pacific Northwest. He'd been driving for 6 years, mostly doing runs between Seattle and Portland, occasionally venturing east into Idaho. He was a practical man, not given to superstition or flights of imagination. That's what made his experience at the Dworshak Dam rest area so difficult for him to process. It was February 9th, 2020, around 3:15 a.m. James had been hauling electronics from Spokane to Portland and he needed a break. The Dworshak rest area on Highway 12 was his usual stop for this route. Isolated, quiet, rarely crowded at this hour. That night, his was the only truck in the lot. The facility was typical for rural Idaho. A small concrete building with restrooms, vending machines, and a covered picnic area. Everything was well maintained, but basic. The temperature was below freezing and James's breath formed clouds as he walked from his truck to the building. Inside the men's room, the fluorescent lights flickered irregularly, making everything look slightly unreal. James used the facilities and was washing his hands when he first noticed something odd in the mirror above the sink. For just a moment, his reflection didn't quite match his movements. It lagged behind by maybe half a second. He stopped moving, watching carefully. His reflection stopped too, now perfectly synchronized. James laughed at himself. Fatigue playing tricks on his eyes, nothing more. He finished washing his hands and looked up at the mirror again. His reflection was smiling at him. James wasn't smiling. He stood perfectly still, his face neutral. The reflection's smile widened. It wasn't his smile. The expression was wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. The eyes were wrong too, slightly different in shape, with pupils that seemed too large. "What the hell?" James whispered. The reflection's mouth moved, but not in sync with his words. It spoke a moment later, and though James couldn't hear it through the mirror, he could read its lips. It was saying something different, something he couldn't quite make out. James backed away from the sink. The reflection didn't move. It stayed where it was, hands on the sink edge, leaning forward slightly, still smiling that wrong smile. Then it raised one hand and waved at James. A slow, deliberate wave, like a goodbye or an invitation. Terror hit James like a physical force. He turned and pushed through the bathroom door, bursting out into the main lobby area. His heart was racing, his breath coming in short gasps. He stood there for a moment, trying to rationalize what he'd seen. Fatigue, stress, maybe carbon monoxide exposure from the truck. But he knew what he'd seen. He should have left, should have gone straight to his truck and driven away. But something made him go back. Curiosity, or maybe the need to prove to himself that he'd imagined it. He pushed the bathroom door open and stepped inside. The mirror showed the normal reflection, him standing in the doorway looking frightened. He approached the sink carefully, watching the reflection move with him. Perfectly synchronized. Everything seemed normal. He leaned closer, examining his reflection's face. Normal, matching his movements exactly. Then he noticed the background. In the mirror behind his reflection, one of the stall doors was open. In reality, all 3 stall doors were closed. He'd checked them when he first came in, an old habit from his early driving days, making sure he was alone. James turned around slowly. The stall doors were still closed. He turned back to the mirror. The reflected stall door was still open, and now there was something in the opening. A figure standing in the darkness of the stall, barely visible, watching. In the mirror, the figure stepped out of the stall. It was humanoid but wrong, too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at too many joints. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and where its face should be was just smooth, pale skin, featureless except for a wide mouth that opened and opened and opened. James spun around. The stalls were still closed. Nothing was there. He looked back at the mirror. The figure was closer now, standing directly behind his reflection. It reached out with one impossibly long arm, and its hand passed through the reflection's shoulder. Fingers sinking into the image like it was reaching through water. The reflection's expression changed. The eyes went wide with terror, the mouth opening in a silent scream. The reflection began to struggle, fighting against something James couldn't see, while James himself stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. The thing in the mirror wrapped its arms around the reflection, pulling it backward. The reflection fought, hands clawing at the sink, at the edges of the mirror, but it was being dragged away, pulled into the darkness behind it. James watched his own face contort in terror and agony, watched himself being taken by something that shouldn't exist. Then the reflection was gone. The mirror showed an empty bathroom. No James, just the sinks, the stalls, the white tile walls. James looked down at himself. He was still there, still real, still solid. But his reflection was gone. He ran, burst out of the bathroom, out of the building, across the parking lot to his truck. He climbed into the cab and locked every door, hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the keys. He started the engine and got out of there, driving well over the speed limit, not caring about the load shift or the ice on the road. James called in sick for the next week. He told his dispatcher he had the flu, but the truth was he couldn't make himself get in the truck. He finally forced himself back to work, but he changed his route. He never drove Highway 12 again, never went anywhere near the Dworshak Dam rest area. The worst part came 3 weeks later. James was at home, brushing his teeth before bed. He looked in his bathroom mirror and saw his reflection looking back at him, perfectly normal. Then his reflection smiled, that wrong smile, too wide, too many teeth. It raised one hand and waved at him. A slow, deliberate wave. James hasn't looked in a mirror since. He removed all the mirrors from his house, covers the rear-view mirrors in his truck with duct tape, uses the side cameras instead. His co-workers think he's developed some kind of phobia. They're not entirely wrong. He knows his reflection is still out there somewhere, in that mirror at the rest stop, and he knows that something else is looking back at him from every reflective surface he encounters. Something wearing his face, waiting patiently for the right moment to reach through. Story 4. The Midnight Mechanic. Paul Henderson had driven 18-wheelers for 14 years, and he'd learned that mechanical problems always happened at the worst possible times. But when his truck developed a severe coolant leak at 1:45 a.m. in rural Wyoming, he thought he'd gotten lucky. He managed to limp into a rest area on Interstate 25, about 60 miles north of Cheyenne, before the engine could overheat and destroy itself. The rest area was deserted, just Paul's Peterbilt sitting under the flickering lights of the parking lot. The wind howled across the open Wyoming prairie, rocking the trailer slightly. Paul assessed the damage with a flashlight. The lower radiator hose had split, coolant pooling underneath the engine. He had a spare hose in his repair kit, but changing it at night in below freezing temperatures was going to be miserable. He was gathering his tools when headlights appeared on the access road. An older pickup truck, maybe 1980s vintage, pulled into the rest area and parked near Paul's rig. A man got out, tall, maybe 60 years old, wearing greasy coveralls and a battered trucker cap. He carried a large toolbox. "Saw you were having trouble," the man said, his voice rough but friendly. Paul was immediately grateful. "Radiator hose split." The man set down his toolbox and examined the engine with practiced ease. "Yeah, I can fix that for you. Take about 30 minutes. It was a reasonable price for emergency roadside service. Paul agreed immediately. The man got to work with impressive efficiency, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this repair 1,000 times. Paul stood nearby, holding the flashlight and making small talk. "You do this full-time?" "Something like that," the man replied. "Been helping drivers out here for longer than I can remember. These old highways, they're hard on equipment." As the man worked, Paul noticed something odd. Despite the freezing temperature, the man's breath wasn't fogging. Paul could see his own breath forming white clouds, but the mechanic showed no breath at all. And his skin looked strange in the flashlight beam, too pale with an odd waxy quality. Paul asked. The man laughed. "Night shift will do that to you. I'm fine, friend." 20 minutes later, the repair was complete. The man packed up his tools and stood up, wiping his hands on a rag that looked decades old. "That should hold you all the way to wherever you're going. Just remember to check your hoses regular." Paul pulled out his wallet. The man took the bills and tucked them into his coverall pocket. "You drive safe now." "Thanks again. I really appreciate this. Can I get your name?" The man paused, a strange expression crossing his face. "Name's Eddie. Eddie Morrison, but don't worry about recommendations." He walked back to his pickup truck and Paul watched him drive away, taillights disappearing into the darkness. Paul climbed back into his cab, started the engine, and checked the temperature gauge. Perfect. The repair was solid. He pulled out of the rest area and continued north, grateful for the encounter. The next day, Paul stopped at a truck stop in Casper for fuel. He mentioned the midnight mechanic to another driver, describing the location and the man's old pickup truck. The other driver's face went white. Eddie Morrison. The driver pulled out his phone and searched for something, then showed Paul a newspaper article from 1997. It was an obituary. Eddie Morrison, age 54, longtime mechanic specializing in diesel repair, killed in an accident on Interstate 25 near mile marker 97. He'd been changing a tire for a stranded trucker when another vehicle struck him. He died at the scene. Paul felt his blood turn to ice. That's impossible. I just saw him last night. That's the third time I've heard that story this year, the driver said. Different drivers, different dates, but always the same description. Old pickup truck, coveralls, trucker cap. Paul didn't want to believe it. He insisted there must be someone else, maybe Eddie's son, carrying on the family business. But when he researched further, he found no record of any Eddie Morrison having children. No record of anyone by that name operating a roadside assistance service in Wyoming. He found something else, though, a forum for truckers, where dozens of drivers had reported similar experiences over the past 25 years. Late-night breakdowns near that rest area, an old mechanic appearing out of nowhere, always the same description, always the same price. Some drivers had tried to photograph him, but their cameras malfunctioned or captured only blurred images. One driver reported that the $50 bills he'd paid with were found in his cab the next morning, tucked into his logbook. Paul checked his own wallet. The $50 he'd paid Eddie Morrison was back, neatly folded, tucked into a pocket he hadn't used. Along with the money was a handwritten receipt on old yellowed paper. Radiator hose replacement, no charge, drive safe. Paul still drives I-25 through Wyoming regularly. He maintains his truck meticulously now, checking every hose, every belt, every potential failure point. He doesn't want to break down near that rest area again. Not because he's afraid. Eddie Morrison seemed friendly enough, helpful even. But Paul has questions he doesn't want answered. Questions about what kind of existence Eddie Morrison is experiencing, still working the night shift 28 years after his death. Questions about whether Eddie knows he's dead or if he's trapped in an endless loop, forever responding to breakdowns that happened decades ago, and Paul wonders what would happen if someone refused to pay or treated Eddie with disrespect. The thought of that mechanic's friendly expression turning into something else there in the dark miles from anywhere keeps Paul awake sometimes. So he maintains his truck, and he carries cash, and he always treats mechanics with respect, just in case. Story 5. The Children's Playground. Sandra Williams had been driving commercial vehicles for 9 years when she encountered something at a rest stop in rural Virginia that made her question everything she thought she understood about reality. She was a careful driver, always sober, always rested, with an exemplary safety record. What happened to her had nothing to do with fatigue or impairment. It was April 17, 2018, around 2:30 a.m. Sandra was hauling furniture from North Carolina to Pennsylvania, taking Interstate 81 through the Shenandoah Valley. She pulled into the Fairfield Rest Area, a standard facility with picnic tables, a small playground, and the usual amenities. At this hour, 2 other trucks were parked there, but she couldn't see any other drivers around. Sandra used the restroom and bought a coffee from the vending machine. She was walking back to her truck when she heard it. Children's laughter, high and clear, coming from the direction of the playground. She stopped, confused. It was 2:45 in the morning. What children would be at a rest stop at this hour? She walked toward the playground, concerned that some kids might be in trouble, maybe separated from their parents. The playground was typical. Swings, a slide, a small merry-go-round, all painted in primary colors that looked garish under the sodium lights. And there were children there, maybe 6 or 7 of them, playing. They looked to be between 6 and 10 years old, wearing clothes that seemed oddly old-fashioned, dresses and shorts that looked like they were from the 1950s or 60s. They were playing normally, taking turns on the slimming, pushing each other on the swings. Their laughter sounded genuine, joyful even. "Hey kids," Sandra called out. "Where are your parents?" The children stopped playing and turned to look at her. Their faces were expressionless, blank in a way that children's faces should never be. They stared at her in complete silence for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 seconds. Then one of the little girls smiled. Her voice was too flat, too monotone, lacking the natural cadence of a child's speech. "I need to find your parents," Sandra said, unease crawling up her spine. "We're not alone," a boy said. "We have each other." The children resumed playing, but something was deeply wrong. Sandra watched them, trying to understand what was bothering her. Then she realized. They cast no shadows. The overhead lights were bright, and everything else in the playground area cast sharp shadows on the concrete. But the children cast none. Sandra backed away slowly. The children ignored her now, absorbed in their play. She noticed other details. Their movements were slightly off, too smooth, like video game characters rather than real kids. When they laughed, their mouths opened, but the sound came a fraction of a second too late, as if dubbed. She was about to turn and run back to her truck when she saw the woman. She was standing at the edge of the playground, partially hidden by the restroom building. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like a nurse's uniform from decades ago, her face was obscured by shadow, but Sandra could feel her watching. Sandra called out, "They need supervision. It's not safe." The woman stepped forward into the light. Sandra's words died in her throat. The woman's face was wrong. Features stretched vertically, eyes too large, mouth too wide. Her skin had a grayish tint, and she moved with an unnatural stillness, as if she was gliding rather than walking. "They're very well supervised," the woman said, her voice echoing strangely. "They're always supervised." "I'm calling the police," Sandra managed to say, pulling out her phone. "That won't help," the woman said. "They can't see them. Most people can't, but you can. That's interesting." Sandra's phone showed no signal despite having full bars just minutes ago. The woman glided closer. The children had stopped playing again and were all watching Sandra with those blank, expressionless faces. The woman asked, "We could use another adult. The children do so love when grown-ups join their games." Sandra ran. She sprinted across the parking lot to her truck, fumbling with her keys, expecting to feel hands grabbing her from behind at any moment. She got the door open, threw herself inside, and locked it. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely start the engine. In her mirrors, she could see the playground. The children were still there, and the woman was standing at the edge of the parking lot watching Sandra's truck. The woman raised one hand in a gesture that might have been a wave or might have been something else. Sandra drove out of the rest area without checking her surroundings, nearly sideswiping one of the parked trucks in her panic. She drove for 2 hours straight, not stopping until she reached a well-lit truck stop in Pennsylvania with dozens of other vehicles and people around. She reported what she'd seen to the police. They investigated but found nothing unusual at the Fairfield rest area. No children, no woman in a nurse's uniform, nothing out of the ordinary. They suggested Sandra had been exhausted, perhaps experiencing micro-sleep hallucinations. But Sandra started researching. She found reports dating back to the 1970s. Travelers reporting seeing children at the Fairfield rest area late at night. Several people had disappeared from that rest stop over the decades. 3 confirmed missing person cases where vehicles were found empty, doors locked, keys inside, no signs of struggle. More disturbing, she found historical records of the land. Before the interstate was built, before the rest area was constructed, the site had been a state children's home in the early 1900s. It burned down in 1923, killing 38 children and 3 staff members. The fire was ruled accidental, but there were rumors, unproven allegations of abuse and neglect. Sandra still drives I-81, but she plans her routes carefully now to avoid that rest area. She times her trips so she never needs to stop there. And she's never told anyone the full story, not even her family. Because the part she can't explain, the part that haunts her dreams, is what she saw just before she drove away. In her side mirror, for just a moment, she saw herself. She was standing with the children, holding hands with the little girl who'd spoken first, her face blank and expressionless, caught forever in that playground under the flickering lights. Another woman in a uniform stood beside her, welcoming the newest addition to their eternal supervision duty. Sandra looked forward through her windshield. She was still in her truck, still driving, still real. But somewhere, in some version of that night, she knows a different Sandra stayed behind. Story number 6, The Empty Family. Thomas Burke had been a trucker for 11 years, specializing in overnight routes across the American South. He preferred night driving, less traffic, cooler temperatures, better fuel economy. But after what happened at the rest area outside Montgomery, Alabama, he seriously considered changing to day shifts. It was July 8, 2019, around midnight. Thomas was hauling industrial parts from Atlanta to New Orleans on Interstate 65. He stopped at a rest area he'd been to dozens of times before, a medium-sized facility with decent lighting and usually good security. That night, the parking lot was nearly empty, just his truck and one passenger vehicle, a minivan, parked near the building. Thomas did his pre-rest routine, checking his load straps and airlines. As he was walking toward the restroom, he noticed the minivan more closely. It was running, engine on, lights off. Through the windows, he could see people inside. A family, it looked like. Mom, Dad, and a couple of kids in car seats in the back. Thomas thought it was odd that they were just sitting there, but it wasn't his business. He used the restroom and got a snack from the vending machine. When he came back out, the minivan was still there, engine still running, family still sitting motionless inside. Something about it bothered him. Maybe they were having car trouble or one of the kids was sick. Thomas approached the van and knocked gently on the driver's side window. "Excuse me, folks? Everything okay?" No response. The driver, a man in his 40s wearing a polo shirt, didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge Thomas at all. He was staring straight ahead at nothing, hands on the steering wheel. The woman in the passenger seat was equally motionless, her face turned slightly toward the window, but her eyes unfocused. Thomas knocked harder. "Hello? Sir? Ma'am?" Nothing. Not a flicker of movement. Thomas felt genuine concern now. He pulled out his phone to call 911, but before he could dial, the driver's head slowly turned toward him. The movement was mechanical, like an animatronic in a theme park. The man's eyes locked onto Thomas's, and Thomas felt his stomach drop. The man's eyes were completely black. No whites, no irises, just solid black from edge to edge. His face was expressionless, slack, as if every muscle had gone dead. Thomas backed away from the van, his heart racing. The man continued to stare at him, his head tracking Thomas's movement with that same mechanical precision. Then the woman's head turned. Same black eyes, same slack expression. In the back seat, Thomas could now see the children more clearly. Their heads were turning too, all focusing on him. Two kids, maybe 5 and 7 years old, both with those same completely black eyes, both with that same dead expression. "Jesus Christ," Thomas whispered. He should have run, should have gotten in his truck and left immediately. But he was frozen, unable to look away from those 4 pairs of black eyes, all fixed on him with terrible intensity. The driver's mouth opened. No words came out, but his jaw dropped farther than should have been physically possible, hinging open until his chin nearly touched his chest. The woman's mouth opened next, then the children's. All 4 of them sat there with mouths gaping impossibly wide, staring at Thomas with those black eyes. A sound came from the van, not from the people inside, but from the vehicle itself. A low, thrumming vibration that Thomas felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. The van began to shake slightly, rocking on its suspension. The windows started to fog from the inside, frost forming in intricate patterns despite the summer heat. Thomas finally broke free from his paralysis and ran. He sprinted to his truck, climbed into the cab, and locked every door. His hands were shaking as he started the engine. He was pulling out of his parking space when he made the mistake of looking in his mirror. The family was out of the van. All 4 of them were standing in a line, perfectly still, watching his truck. But they'd changed. They were taller now, stretched vertically, their proportions all wrong. Their arms hung too long, nearly reaching the ground. Their heads were tilted at impossible angles, and those black eyes reflected his taillights like an animal's. Thomas hit the accelerator harder than he should have, his trailer swaying dangerously as he took the curve out of the rest area too fast. He didn't care. He just needed to get away from there. He drove straight through to New Orleans, 5 hours without stopping, his heart rate not returning to normal until he was in the loading dock at his destination with other people around. He didn't report what he'd seen. Who would believe it? But he started checking online forums, looking for similar experiences. He found them. Dozens of reports from across the country going back years. Families in vehicles at rest areas late at night, always sitting motionless, always with those black eyes when someone looked closely. Some reported that the families asked for help, spoke in monotone voices, tried to lure Good Samaritans closer. Several people had disappeared from rest areas after reporting encounters with these strange families. Their vehicles were found empty, keys inside, no sign of struggle. Security footage from one incident in Tennessee showed a trucker approaching a minivan, speaking with someone inside, then simply walking away from his truck and disappearing into the woods beyond the rest area. He was never found. Thomas found historical accounts too, predating modern rest areas. Travelers on old highways reporting similar encounters. Families in broken-down cars, always at night, always asking for help, always wrong somehow. The details varied, but the core elements were consistent across decades of reports. The theory that disturbed Thomas most came from a paranormal researcher who'd studied these cases. She believed they were some kind of mimicry. Entities that created the appearance of families in distress to lure and prey. The families people saw weren't ghosts or demons, but something worse. Things that wore the shape of humans like a costume, imperfectly copying what they'd observed, creating something that looked almost right but was fundamentally wrong in ways the human brain instinctively recognized. Thomas still drives I-65, but he's changed his behavior at rest areas. He never approaches other vehicles, no matter how suspicious they look. If he sees a vehicle with people inside just sitting there, he gets back in his truck and leaves immediately. He's been called heartless by other drivers who've witnessed his refusal to check on seemingly stranded motorists. But Thomas knows better. He knows that not everything that looks human is human. He knows that there are things out there on the highways at night that prey on compassion, on the instinct to help someone in need. And he knows that the family he saw that night wasn't a family at all. Just something wearing their shapes, waiting patiently in that rest area for the right person to come close enough. He wonders how many other families are sitting in rest areas right now, all across the country, waiting in the dark with their black eyes and their too wide mouths, patient as only immortal things can be. Story 7. The Footsteps on the Roof. Daniel Martinez had driven for Swift Transportation for 7 years, running routes across the western states. He was experienced, careful, and had never filed an accident report. He thought he'd seen everything the road could throw at him, until the night of November 3rd, 2021, at a remote rest area in Nevada. The rest area was on Highway 50, the so-called loneliest road in America, about 90 miles east of Fallon. It was 1:20 a.m., and Daniel needed to take his mandatory rest break. The facility was primitive, just a parking area, pit toilets, and a couple of picnic tables. No lights except for what Daniel's headlights provided as he pulled in. His was the only vehicle there. Daniel did his inspection and climbed into the sleeper berth of his Freightliner. He set his alarm for 8 hours and settled in. The Nevada night was quiet, just wind whistling across the desert and the occasional tick of his cooling engine. He was almost asleep when he heard it. Footsteps on the roof of his cab. Daniel's eyes snapped open. The footsteps were distinct, boot heels on metal, walking slowly from the front of the cab toward the back. Step, 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 step. Steady, deliberate, heavy enough to be clearly audible, but not heavy enough to make the cab rock. Daniel lay perfectly still, his heart pounding. It had to be an animal, maybe a coyote or a large bird, but it sounded like footsteps, human footsteps, walking across his roof. The steps reached the back of the cab, right above where Daniel was lying. They stopped. Silence. Daniel waited, barely breathing. Maybe whatever it was had jumped off. He was starting to relax when the footsteps started again. Walking back toward the front of the cab. This time, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and quickly climbed into the driver's seat. He needed to see what was up there. He opened the driver's door and stepped out onto the running board, shining his flashlight up at the roof. Nothing. The roof was empty. No animal, no person, nothing. Daniel walked around the entire truck, checking every angle. The top of the cab was undisturbed, no footprints in the light dust that had accumulated there, no scratches, no signs that anything had been up there at all. He even climbed up on the tire to get a better look. Completely empty. He was standing there, confused, when the footsteps started again. Right above him. He could hear them clearly, boot heels on metal, walking across the roof. But he was looking directly at the roof, and there was nothing there. The footsteps were happening, but they were invisible. Daniel jumped down and backed away from his truck. The footsteps continued, walking from front to back, then stopping. Daniel heard something else now. A scraping sound, like something being dragged across metal. Then 3 hard impacts, like someone pounding on the roof with a fist. Daniel shouted. Silence. The desert wind was the only sound. Daniel waited for 5 minutes, watching his truck. Nothing moved. No sounds. Eventually, he worked up the courage to approach again. He banged on the side of the cab. Laughter. Right above his head. A man's laugh, deep and mocking. Daniel looked up and saw nothing, but the laughter continued, echoing strangely in the open desert air. Then the footsteps started again, but this time they were running. Fast, hard impacts, racing across the roof from front to back. Daniel ran to his cab, jumped inside, and locked the doors. He grabbed his phone, no signal, of course. He was 90 miles from the nearest town, alone on the loneliest road in America, and something was on his truck. From inside the cab, Daniel could still hear it. The footsteps were everywhere now. On the roof, on the hood, on the sides of the trailer. Multiple sets of footsteps, dozens of them, walking and running and pounding. The entire truck shook with the impacts. Daniel could see nothing outside, but the sounds were overwhelming, coming from every direction. Then came the voices. Men's voices shouting in a language Daniel didn't recognize. They sounded angry, urgent, like orders being called out in battle. Mixed with the voices were other sounds, metal clanging, wheels creaking, sounds that didn't belong in the modern world. Daniel covered his ears, but it didn't help. The sounds were impossibly loud now, and he realized with horror that they were coming from inside the cab as well. Footsteps running through the sleeper berth, voices shouting right next to his head, the smell of smoke and something else. Gunpowder maybe, or burning oil. It lasted for 15 minutes. 15 minutes of chaos, of invisible activity swirling around and through his truck. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Daniel sat there for another hour, too terrified to move. Finally, as the first light of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, he started his engine and got the hell out of there. He drove straight through to Reno, not stopping, not even slowing down except for fuel. He reported the incident to his dispatcher, who was understandably skeptical, but Daniel insisted on changing his route. He refused to drive Highway 50 anymore, and when the company pushed back, he threatened to quit. They eventually accommodated him. Later, Daniel researched the history of that area. He found that Highway 50 followed roughly the same route as the Pony Express Trail from the 1860s. He also found accounts of a stagecoach attack that had happened in 1933, right around the area where that rest stop was located. A group of travelers had been killed in the attack. Their stagecoach burned. More disturbing, he found modern accounts from other truckers. At least 11 drivers had reported similar experiences at that same rest area over the past 30 years. Footsteps on their roofs, voices in unfamiliar languages, sounds of violence and chaos. 3 drivers had abandoned their trucks there, walking away in the middle of the night and refusing to return. Their employers had to send other drivers to retrieve the vehicles. One driver's account particularly chilled Daniel. The man had recorded audio of the incident on his phone. Daniel found the recording posted on a paranormal website. It was terrifying. Footsteps, shouting, sounds of metal on metal, all captured clearly. But the most disturbing part came at the end. After all the chaos stopped, there was a voice speaking clearly in modern English. "They can't see us, but we see them. Every night we see them. Coming through our territory, disturbing our rest. Make them stop." Daniel never drove Highway 50 again. He took longer routes, wasted fuel, missed delivery windows, anything to avoid that stretch of road. His company eventually let him go, frustrated with his refusal to take certain routes. He found work with a smaller outfit that let him stay in California and Oregon. He sold his house and moved to the coast, as far from Nevada as he could get while staying in the region. He still drives, but only during the day now, and he never takes mandatory rest breaks at isolated rest areas. He parks at busy truck stops, surrounded by other drivers and activity. Because Daniel knows that what happened to him that night wasn't an isolated incident. Something is happening at rest areas across the American West, particularly on old highways that follow historic trails. The past isn't gone. It's still there, playing out over and over, invisible to most, but not silent, never silent. And Daniel knows that next time he might not be so lucky. Next time the footsteps might not stay on the outside. They might come through the doors, through the walls, and then he'd find out what happens when the invisible becomes visible, when the past finally catches up with the present. Story 8. The Repeating Night. Catherine Chen had been a long-haul trucker for 10 years when she experienced something that broke her understanding of time itself. She was a practical woman with a degree in logistics, not prone to flights of imagination or superstition. What happened to her at the rest area outside of Tucumcari, New Mexico, defied everything she thought she knew about how reality worked. It was September 19th, 2022 at 11:47 p.m. Catherine had been driving from Amarillo to Albuquerque on Interstate 40, a route she'd driven hundreds of times. She pulled into a rest area she'd stopped at many times before, the Tucumcari rest area, a decent facility with good lighting and usually well-maintained. She planned to take a short break, maybe 30 minutes, then continue to Albuquerque. Catherine used the restroom, bought a coffee and a granola bar from the vending machines, and sat at a picnic table to eat. The parking lot had 4 other trucks, their running lights creating a comfortable sense of activity. She finished her snack, checked her watch, 12:08 a.m., and walked back to her truck. As she was climbing into her cab, something felt strange. She couldn't quite identify what, just a sense of wrongness. She started her engine and was about to pull out when she noticed something in her logbook. The last entry she'd made should have shown her arrival at the rest area at 11:47 p.m. But instead it showed 12:08 a.m. That was impossible. She'd just written the arrival time a few minutes ago. Catherine shook her head. She must have misremembered. She was tired. She added a departure time, 12:10 a.m., and pulled out of the parking area. As she was merging back onto I-40, she glanced at the rest area sign. It caught her attention for some reason, though she couldn't say why. 5 minutes down the highway, Catherine saw another rest area sign ahead. The Tucumcari rest area, 1 mile. She looked at her GPS, confused. She'd just left the Tucumcari rest area. There shouldn't be another one for 30 miles. But the sign was clear, and as she passed it, the familiar exit ramp appeared on her right. Catherine didn't take the exit. She kept driving, feeling unsettled. She checked her GPS again. It showed her exactly where she should be, several miles past the rest area. But she knew what she'd seen. That sign had been real. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Catherine's radio crackled with static. She looked at the clock on her dashboard. It read 11:47 p.m. That was impossible. It had been after midnight just a few minutes ago. She checked her watch, had written it in her logbook. Catherine pulled over to the shoulder, her hands shaking. She looked at her watch, 11:47 p.m. She pulled out her phone, 11:47 p.m. She grabbed her logbook. The last entry showed her arrival at the Tucumcari rest area at 11:47 p.m. The departure time she'd just written, 12:10 a.m., was gone. Impossible. This was impossible. Catherine sat there for a few minutes, trying to rationalize what was happening. Carbon monoxide poisoning? A stroke? Some kind of temporal lobe seizure causing time distortion? But everything felt normal. She felt fine, alert, fully conscious. She pulled back onto the highway and continued west. Sure enough, exactly where it should be, the Tucumcari rest area sign appeared, 1 mile ahead. Catherine made a decision and took the exit. She needed to understand what was happening. The rest area was identical to what she remembered. Same lighting, same layout. 4 other trucks were parked there. The same 4 she'd seen before. Same positions, same trucks. Catherine walked to the building and pushed open the door to the women's restroom. Inside, a woman was washing her hands at the sink. She looked up and smiled at Catherine. "Evening." "Yeah," Catherine managed. The woman looked familiar, but Catherine couldn't place her. She used the facilities, and when she came out, the woman was gone. Catherine walked to the vending area and bought the same coffee and granola bar she'd purchased before. Or had she purchased them? She couldn't quite remember now. She sat at the same picnic table and ate. The whole time she had the strange sensation of déjà vu, as if she were watching herself perform actions she'd already completed. She checked her watch. 12:08 a.m. Time was moving normally. Whatever had happened earlier wasn't repeating. Catherine walked back to her truck, climbed into the cab and checked her logbook. She'd written arrival at 11:47 p.m. She added departure at 12:10 a.m. As she started her engine, that same sense of wrongness washed over her, stronger now. She pulled out of the parking area and merged onto I-40 westbound. 5 minutes later, the sign appeared. Tucumcari Rest Area, 1 mile. Catherine felt her chest tighten. No, this wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She kept driving, passing the exit. She checked her dashboard clock, 12:15 a.m. Everything was fine. She was past the rest area, making progress toward Albuquerque. At exactly 11:47 p.m., her radio crackled with static. Catherine looked at the clock. 11:47 p.m. She felt tears of frustration and fear forming. She pulled over again, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. She was stuck in some kind of loop. Every time she left the rest area, time reset to 11:47 p.m., and the cycle began again. She would drive for a few minutes past the rest area again and then jump backward to 11:47. Catherine tried different approaches. She didn't stop at the rest area, just drove past it. Time reset anyway. She stopped at the rest area but didn't get out of her truck. Time reset. She stopped, got out, but didn't enter the building. Time reset. Each time, the loop brought her back to 11:47 p.m. Each time she found herself approaching the Tucumcari rest area again. After the 7th loop, Catherine noticed something new. The 4 trucks in the parking lot. She recognized one of them now. It was her own truck. The same Volvo VNL she was driving, same trailer, same company logo. But she was in her truck. How could her truck be parked there? She pulled into the rest area, parked next to the other version of her truck, and approached it. Through the window, she could see someone in the driver's seat, a woman who looked exactly like her. The woman turned and looked at Catherine, her face showing the same fear and confusion Catherine felt. The woman in the truck mouthed something. Catherine couldn't hear it, but she could read the lips. "Help me." Catherine backed away. She looked around the parking lot. All 4 trucks were hers. Different iterations, different moments in the loop. She could see figures in some of them. Versions of herself, all trapped, all aware they were trapped. On the 9th loop, Catherine tried a different strategy. Instead of leaving, she stayed at the rest area. She sat at the picnic table and watched the clock on her phone. 11:47 became 11:48, became 11:49. Time was passing normally. She stayed there for 2 hours until nearly 2 o'clock a.m. Then she walked back to her truck and left. She merged onto I-40, hopeful that she'd broken the cycle. 5 minutes down the highway, the sign appeared. "Tucumcari Rest Area, 1 mile," Catherine screamed in frustration. At 11:47 p.m., her radio crackled. The loop continued. Catherine lost count of how many iterations. 10, 15, maybe 20. Each time she tried something different. Each time the reset happened, she began to notice things changing slightly. The woman she'd seen in the restroom, Catherine realized it was another version of herself from a previous loop. The sense of déjà vu was because she was literally repeating her own actions. Then, on what might have been the 23rd loop, something different happened. As Catherine sat at the picnic table, another truck pulled into the rest area. A man got out, walked to the building, nodded at Catherine as he passed. "Excuse me," Catherine called. The man checked his watch. 11:52 p.m. "First time." Catherine felt a chill. "You should leave right now." The man looked concerned. "You okay, ma'am?" "No, please, just trust me." The man backed away, clearly thinking Catherine was unstable. He hurried back to his truck and pulled out, leaving the rest area quickly. Catherine watched him go, hoping he'd escape the loop she was trapped in. At 11:47 p.m., her radio crackled. Catherine looked at the clock. The man's truck was in the parking lot, right where it had been before. He was walking toward the building, same as before. The loop had taken him too. Catherine tried to warn him again, but it played out the same way. Every loop he arrived, she warned him. He left. Every loop, the reset brought him back. Another prisoner? It was on the 31st loop. Catherine was counting now, scratching marks into her logbook, that she finally understood. She was walking past her truck when she noticed something on the hood, a mark in the dust. It read, "Don't stop, keep driving." Her own initials, her own warning. From how many loops ago? She had no way to know. Catherine made a decision. On the next loop, she didn't stop at all. When she approached the rest area at 11:47 p.m., she kept driving, pushed the accelerator down, and drove as fast as she dared. She passed the exit at 70 miles per hour. 5 minutes later, no sign appeared. 10 minutes. 15. She checked her clock, 12:02 a.m. Time was still moving forward. She'd broken the loop. Catherine drove straight through to Albuquerque, afraid to stop, afraid that any rest area might trap her again. She arrived at her destination with the sun coming up, exhausted beyond measure. She pulled into the loading dock and checked her logbook. There, in her own handwriting, were 31 arrival times at the Tucumcari rest area, all at 11:47 p.m. 31 scratched marks at the bottom of the page, 31 iterations that she'd somehow retained memory of. Even though time had reset, Catherine finished that delivery and drove home. She told her company she needed time off, claimed a family emergency. They gave her 2 weeks. She spent that time researching, trying to understand what had happened to her. She found scattered reports online, other drivers reporting time anomalies at rest areas, particularly in New Mexico and Arizona, stories of loops, of repeated experiences of time behaving strangely. Most of these accounts were dismissed as fatigue hallucinations or mental health episodes. But Catherine knew better. She knew that something was fundamentally wrong at that rest area, some kind of temporal distortion that trapped people in loops. She wondered about the other truckers whose trucks she'd seen, the versions of herself trapped in other iterations. Were they still there, still living that same loop over and over, unaware that Catherine had escaped? Catherine quit long-haul trucking. She couldn't risk it anymore. She took a job doing local deliveries, never going more than 50 miles from home. She avoids rest areas entirely now, preferring to plan her breaks at truck stops with lots of other people around. She kept her logbook from that night, the one with 31 arrival times. She looks at it sometimes, reminding herself that it was real, that she didn't imagine it. And she wonders about that man she'd seen, the one who'd pulled in during one of the loops. Did he escape? Is he still trapped there, living the same half hour over and over, slowly going mad as Catherine nearly did? Most disturbing of all, Catherine sometimes wakes at night checking her clock, terrified that it will read 11:47 p.m. Terrified that she never really escaped at all, that this life she's living now, the local job, the safety of home, is just another part of the loop, a longer iteration before the inevitable reset. She has no way to know for certain, and that uncertainty more than anything has changed her. She lives each day acutely aware that reality is far more fragile than she'd ever imagined, that time itself can break, trapping you in moments that repeat forever, conscious and aware but unable to escape. The Tucumcari rest area is still there, still operating, still welcoming tired travelers off Interstate 40. And Catherine wonders how many people stop there on any given night. How many of them are real and how many are just echoes, trapped iterations playing out the same scene over and over, invisible to everyone except others who've been caught in the same impossible loop.